Democracy is often spoken of as a default good, but in the digital age, when attention, data, and automated persuasion are currency, what does democracy actually mean? Who is it that's running it? And are we actually getting the system that we signed up for? I think we need to talk about it.
And if you haven't already, remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss our weekly episodes. New episodes drop every Tuesday. We also released the Rethinking Tech survey, which you'll find in the links below. Let us know what you like so that we can keep giving you what you want to see. Welcome back to Rethinking Tech. I'm Aparna.
And I'm Harinda.
Our podcast breaks the topic of tech apart,
covering the surprising connections to geopolitics, business, and ethics.
We're both humanitarians, and I'm a lawyer, currently enjoying as many pain au chocolat as I possibly can during my last week in Paris.
I'm a former entrepreneur, a globetrotter, and I also overate this week. And so much so that I actually skipped my breakfast this morning.
Every week, we break down the hottest tech topics that you need to know about. Today, our topic is called Rethinking Democracy, which might not sound so tech, but there are so many underlying tech impacts that we can't wait to get into with you. Today, we'll start with the tech implications, then the geopolitical, and then, my favorite, we'll dig right into the ethics. Harinda, kick things off. Rethinking democracy? Why are we talking about this?
So much has happened when we talk about democracy, and even under the name of democracy. Wars have been waged, and dictators and presidents have been thrown off of their base, and much of it is actually driven by technology, not just politics. It's a term that's often overused or even misused, but I think it's also important for us to go back and really look into what has been happening. In 2025, it's a completely different world than when the concept of democracy had been brought together. And it's important for us to evaluate, are we actually doing it right? And if not, what are the issues that we need to discuss?
I like that you say, are we doing it right? Like, what does that even mean? When you think back to the origin of democracy, I think of the Greeks walking around in Athens, eating grapes and talking about philosophy. And really, Athenian democracy is what all of this stems from, where democracy was meant to be participatory, citizen assembly. Mind you, at the time, it was just male citizens. So at least we have advanced past that in some ways. But I am curious to see how far we've come from there, especially in today's day and age. Like you said, 2025 has been a really, really interesting year. And before we dive into today's episode, what do you think the most important value democracy should preserve in order for it to be called democracy within a society? Do you think it's fairness, equality of voice, protection from manipulation? What do you think?
This is one of the hardest questions to answer. And the reason that I think this is because everybody's values are so fractured, not just across voter bases, which is probably the most important dynamic when it comes to democracy, but even in terms of the way that people spend their time, their money, and their passion towards anything. And as a result, you can see that it's also the manipulatability of, or how much of all of these individual things can be manipulated. And so for me, the concept of democracy is really revolved around governance, because that's one of the weakest structures that I'm actually seeing in the world today. What do you think?
Governance, especially clear governance, because it's not so much a lack of governance. It's, I think nowadays, a lack of accountable governance and a lack of systems and the checks and balances actually working the way they're supposed to. Because we can put structures in place, but if they're not working the way they're supposed to, if they're not accountable to someone, and by that, in a democracy, shouldn't you be accountable to the people? If you're no longer accountable to the people, but just accountable to one person, which is what we're seeing in more and more democracies, then that's not a democracy anymore. That's not citizen-based rule.
And this is actually the place that I start to have issue with the concept of democracy in 2025. It's how is it that it's being manipulated? How are the different power structures that are in place really learning the different levers that can be pulled?
Well, speaking of those levers that can be pulled, let's dive right into technology. Because I don't think in today's day and age, you can talk about an election, forget a democratic election, any election, without thinking about the tech implications. You have the usuals, you have the metas, especially Facebook, back when people used Facebook a lot, but also WhatsApp, also Instagram, also TikTok. You're also seeing things like ad spending. And previously, historically, where you'd see a lot of this ad spending maybe over TV or radio ads, now social media has made it so that the more money you spend on advertising, the more attention you buy, has started to directly correlate with the number of votes you have. But let's go into this a bit deeper. What do I mean? Well, let's think about way back in the day, Cambridge Analytica. This happened back before the first Trump presidency, where at the time, a research scientist came out with a survey that Facebook users were paid some small amount of money to take, and in it, they detailed all of their preferences, like absolutely everything you can account for. That data was then purchased, sold, somehow received by a political consulting firm, which then was found to use that data to serve very targeted ads to American consumers, i.e., American voters. To this date, 10 plus years later now, people are still wondering whether that election was won fairly or because of these targeted ads. Whether that's fair, whether that's not fair, that's something that we'll discuss later. But it is interesting to see that targeted ads could have played such an important role.
And I want to go into some of that gray or shaded gray area. And the reason I say that is because there's so much nuance to it. Is it okay for voters to change their minds? Of course. Is it okay for people to be exposed to new information and then change their mind? Of course. But is it okay to manipulate them and to use fake news and to run AI-based campaigns that are starting, for example, from meme accounts, then become hyper-political content-driven accounts that are essentially swaying the way that you are voting? Moreover, the foreign actors, the dark actors that get involved into politics because they want to see different interests and also break down democracy as a process. And all of these are exactly the layers of complexity that we are seeing in democracy that we need to break down. Now, for example, I want to talk about the TikTok deal. In the United States, they want to separate TikTok specifically for US-based users from everyone else in the world. And right after, we got very close to a deal where Donald Trump was announcing that they're so close, President Xi Jinping from China not actually negating it and seems to be going in the direction of approving it. But one of the reasons that I was thinking about this deal is because of two pieces of news that came right after the announcement from Donald Trump. He very clearly had stated that he would like for TikTok in the United States to become MAGA-fied. And that's because it is also well known as a platform for young liberal users. And to know that you can change the way the algorithm works to expose people and actually shift that mindset is actually really important. We also saw Benjamin Netanyahu make the exact same comment in a public sphere, saying that the TikTok deal is one of the most important deals that is going to happen today. And the reason he's saying that is because he knows public sentiment is going against Israel, and using social media, and very specifically manipulating the algorithm, is going to create a more favorable stance for Israel when you use these types of platforms.
So it essentially becomes, if you control the algorithm, you control democracy. And this isn't just a US-based thing. We've known about this for a while. You and I talk about frequently how algorithmic amplification and virality, which, to be clear, rewards outrage, which means the more polarizing the content you have, the more you see hate speech, the more you react to things so viscerally, the more you're going to see it. That's how you know the algorithm is quote unquote winning. Because guess what? As much as you might hate it, that's what's going to keep you on these platforms longer. And that means engagement optimization is going up. This doesn't discriminate between civic mindedness and people who like cat videos or travel memes. It is just trying to get you, it being the algorithm, just wants you to stay on that platform as long as possible. So to come to the TikTok deal that you mentioned, now, if one government is not only going to say that they own it, but then actually own the algorithm so that they're only showing you things that will manipulate you into feeling a certain way, thinking a certain way, believing certain things. To come to your point, we are never going to tell people what to think. But if you are being told what to think by an algorithm and you don't realize it, then that's what's scary. And I think I say this now 17 times in every episode, but humans are so simple. Algorithms are smarter than us. We cannot avoid the manipulation. Unfortunately, our brains are just not that complicated. You look at what happened in Myanmar with the Rohingya population, where the Facebook platform was used to amplify hate speech, and that contributed directly to violence against the Rohingya in Myanmar. And UN investigators went so far as reporting that social media played a pivotal and determining role in that genocide. You know why that was? It was because Meta's product, the engagement and recommendation algorithms, amplified and were therefore implicated in that destruction. And it's not just the US, even though, yes, we talk about the US a lot. I mean, you look at the next biggest democracy or the largest democracy in the world just by population. You look at India, that entire population, based on personal experience, having family members in India, seems to be run purely on disinformation. And this is not me taking one stance or another. This is me reacting to my grandfather sending me a video saying that Prime Minister Narendra Modi did a handstand and walked around some religious site for 2 hours. No, Nanu, that's not possible. But these are the people who are voting. This is what the people believe.
I think it's really important for us to go even to a finer level of detail. Because one of the things that the CEO of Cambridge Analytica used to say is that he used to walk into the offices of any political leader that is going for a campaign and literally show the statistics of how they are able to sway elections. And how is it that that's possible? It's through typically something called micro-targeting. The fact is that everybody who's consuming content on the internet, and specifically in social media, they are able to be targeted individually almost. And the reason for it is because you can see the content that they like, the content that they dwell over, and the content that is gravitating towards them. The first thing is that the algorithm is going to continue to serve content that is going to help them that way. The second thing is that the algorithm is also going to start pulling you towards extremes, because extremes is where you dwell over and hold your attention. And so these mechanisms are incredibly important as the backbone for how advertisers then target you, because they're able to see your interests. They're even able to now use AI to present messages that are unappealing in an appealing way by either putting an AI character that is physically appealing to your preferences, or even being able to soften the language in such a way that we see how the messaging is starting to be manipulated. And we saw this with various elections, even in the United States, where I remember in the first campaign for Donald Trump, they were very successful in being able to convince voters that Hillary is going to win anyway, and you support Hillary, you don't even need to go and vote. She's got this in the bag. And then they had all of these different variations of that statement, all the way to basically telling Trump supporters, Hillary's going to win, you better get out there and vote. And so when you have AI that's actually able to do this and perfect the message, it's like a hackathon for your own mind. If you have the ability to use AI to perfect that message in such a way that it's so appealing, what ends up happening is that you lose agency, the ability for you to have your own thoughts. And what's important about technology is that they don't need to get it right at 100%. They need to get it right at 1%, but over the long term. And that's how they end up changing your mind. So you go from cat videos that are cute all the way to the political spectrum of being able to make you like extreme far right or far left content. And then all of a sudden, you're part of that crowd. And this is where the technology is breaking democracy.
That's a really important point that you made, and I don't think we talk about that nuance enough, which begs the question, which tech failure or success, depending on which side of the debate you fall on, scares you the most? Do you think it's the algorithmic amplification? Do you think it's the covert foreign influence, which we've barely even talked about actually, but is very present, or the opaque micro-targeting, and why? For me, it's definitely the opaque micro-targeting. Something that you and I are very determined to do is to never tell our listeners what to think, what to believe. We want to give them the facts. We want to make them aware so that they know why they're making certain decisions. But the opaque micro-targeting makes it so that people don't realize that they're being, I would say, conned into making certain decisions or believing certain things, because it's happening in such a slight, comfortable, cushioned way that you might have been extremely anti-gun ownership and now be very pro-gun ownership without even realizing it.
It's really because people aren't aware of how AI and algorithms work. This really is a hackathon on your mind. And the reason that it works so well is because of the fact that they are A/B testing their way to getting you to one side or the other. Now, there are, of course, the people that are not worth converting. There's a strategy behind it of What is it that you need to win elections? You need to change this demographic. You need to get these people convinced about this because it's an important voter topic. Because in the end, people choose a candidate based on individual topics that are of affection to them. And so when you have all of these different cohorts, you are now able to create campaigns that convince them. And the place that I'm most concerned about is actually less the technology. It's the fact that we as individuals are defenseless. You are really defenseless to an unlimited number of A/B tests. We are being exposed to more than 20,000 ads a day. How many of them do you know the interests for and how they align? And in fact, the vast majority, if not all of them, you don't know. Now, advertising is something that's so ubiquitous that we just accept it as part of our veneer on the world. But when I look at this as an architecture, and when I look at it as an A/B test to just constantly try to break your mind down, to be convinced of arguments that you typically or originally wouldn't have been, that to me is the point of concern.
Which just begs the question, where will it stop, right? And the other thing that really scares me in this tech space, and maybe it isn't any different from the old days of TV media and radio media, is how votes can be purchased. Just the amount of money you spend in your campaign directly correlates with the number of votes you get, because that doesn't feel very democratic, right? The entire point of democracy was to do what's best for society. Everyone votes based on the direction they think society should go on. It's not based on which ad did you see most recently, which one had the best music, had the best soundtrack, who had the best ambassador. Because truly, that's what we're starting to see now. We're seeing who has the best ambassador. There was that whole Taylor Swift deep fake that came out in the last election in the US, where President Trump said that Taylor Swift was supporting him, and then she was forced to come out and say that, nope, that was actually a deep fake of me. I never made those claims, and was forced to pick a side, which is alarming.
I really appreciate what you're saying because there's something that is also not talked about very much when it comes to social media, and that is the pathways to reach an individual. And these have been created through effectively an algorithm that social media companies own. It's one of the reasons that it's so important for the United States to be able to own TikTok. That pathway to reach American voters, and in fact, eventually outside, is really important because if you are able to play with how you expose people to information, you are essentially able to migrate people towards you. And we see this with X, for example, in which many people hate being on it. And even though they do, they must be on it because there is no other social network that competes against X. And the same thing will happen with TikTok or any other social media platform because in the end, the algorithm is so well personalized to your needs that you're not going to be shifting away. And this also then doubles down on the point of data because all of these platforms have been collecting copious amounts of data on you that it's not just the platform that's able to serve you relevant content, but advertisers are really increasingly accessing this data and then feeding it further into the social media platforms because you can also do that and then targeting you more accurately. And so all of this ecosystem, it really fights against your individual possibility of holding your own stance.
So, all that being said, are there any countries, are there any nations, democratic states out there that are doing it right? Because as I was doing research for this episode, I was starting to come up a little short. I was looking at the two countries being the largest democracies in the world, the United States and India, and had to shy away from using them as examples. The Nordics made a great case. New Zealand, fantastic case. And yes, you know what? No country's perfect, but the number of countries I can now turn to as a beacon of democracy has really started to slip through my fingers.
This is actually really interesting. So when we were doing research, I was looking into the Democracy Index, and this is on a website called ourworldindata.org, and you can actually see how democracy is measured. However, what's really interesting is it's a time series of data. So they use the same framework for measurement over a series of time. And you're actually starting to see that the world as a map is starting to turn more red, which means that democracy really is on a decline. We're seeing even countries like the United States where democratic architecture and values are starting to decline. And this is actually really important because, again, we were talking earlier that democracy is the name in which we enter countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, that we're saying we need to get rid of these despots and dictators and put in a democratically elected official. And we know that this is also a mechanism that is driven by different interests. And so this place for me is really broken. And I think one of the things that's really unfortunate when we talk about democracy is the fact that we are always focused on developing countries and how they are broken democracies. And we keep pointing at them versus us. And I think this is actually one of the fallacies that we see. And in fact, it's also reflected in this map, in which there is a set of values that are very different across the globe, but we use a relatively similar democratic model applied to all of these different countries.
And I think two countries or two types of countries really speak to this. And Singapore prides itself on being a democracy, and it shows that you can be efficient. However, I wouldn't call it a necessarily very open economy or a very open democracy. You still have to be very careful about how certain things are said and what you portray publicly, versus the Nordic states show that you can have openness and efficiency, right? There's almost like, yes, there's a spectrum of governance where you have democracy, you have communism, authoritarianism all the way across. And then you also have within democracy itself another spectrum where you have openness, efficiency. Maybe there's more levers I should be thinking about. But what I am really struggling with now is the openness aspect in the United States and really understanding how a lot of these decisions are being made. That is something that I feel like we have just started to expect from a functioning democracy.
And this speaks to the governance issue, right? I would love to be able to say that if we had strong governance and we could believe in that governance, that we would then be able to talk about democratic values. But we're starting to see across the globe that governance at the institutional level, at the parliamentary level, is starting to decay. And we can point the finger at any country and talk about the hypocrisy that many people are really frustrated with. One of the things is when I was starting to speak to Libyans on the ground in 2012, after Gaddafi was taken out of power, I said, okay, so what comes next? I mean, you guys are celebrating. Everybody's really happy because the dictator has been thrown off. And everybody kind of looked at each other and they said, well, somebody's going to come and help us, right? And their expectation was a foreign power is going to come and help the country rebuild. And it never really happened. It never really played out well. And that's the challenge that you have is that, I'm not I don't want to advocate for how practices are done politically, even how Gaddafi was operating, but he was able to relatively successfully bring together more than dozens of tribes and tribal leaders and villages and areas around Libya and get them into some form of balance. That balance was absolutely broken by all standards. But at the same time, now what we see more than 10 years later is that the war in Libya just didn't result in what people wanted in terms of democracy.
So what does this mean? We're not saying that the Gaddafi regime had it right. But I think what we're saying, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but is that democracy isn't the silver bullet. It's not the answer in and of itself. You can't just appear as a savior in a country and be like, I now declare you to be a democracy and everything will be perfect. No, what is democracy? It's not just about elections. It's also about are citizens' voices genuinely being heard? Is information flowing freely? Can the institutions, this is critical, can the institutions manage complexity without breaking down? Be it through corruption, running away when things get tough, really just focusing on what citizens want and why you've been put there. If you don't have any of that, then you don't really have a democracy. Saying you're a democracy and then acting completely differently, it doesn't make it a democracy, which is why we're having this discussion today, which is why I am starting to feel like the concept of democracy, as beautiful as it is, and which I still very much stand for, we are not starting seeing it in full enactment done all that well.
I also want to tie a little bit of what we were saying on the social media or the technology side and the geopolitical side. So recently, or actually this morning, I was reading an article saying that Keir Starmer in the UK has the lowest ratings ever of any UK PM. And what's amazing is he was voted with a vast majority. But then when you dig into the details, this is one of the quotes that I take from CNN's article. Thanks to Britain's electoral system, Labour won about 2/3 of seats with just 1/3 of the votes cast. Accounting for low turnout, the person speaking, Curtis, said just 1 in 5 Britons voted for Starmer's Labour Party. And if you really think about what that means, we're talking about in the name of democracy in the United Kingdom. This was the mechanism that was brought in. And again, I use also Ursula von der Leyen in the EU. She is the Commission president. How is she voted? And I was trying to map this to individual voters in the EU. Individual voters in the EU vote for political candidates and parties for EU representation. That EU representation, then, this is where it gets disconnected. They start to propose potential candidates. And of course, the majority parties are the ones that are front leading. And then there is a vote in which there has to be an absolute majority in which a commission president is selected. And so this disconnect between who is selected and the mechanism to select for me is also really important because it also starts to break down the challenges that the US has with the electoral college issue on votes. And so all of these mechanisms, which are in order to simplify the complexity of nations that are 350 million citizens and residents, and also in the EU, over 300 million people, it's difficult to be able to convene this. So you do need to simplify it. But in today's day and age, that mechanism is breaking down what democracy really means because we're seeing this difference between what Ursula von der Leyen is saying and what many of the voices are saying on the ground.
And is anyone holding her accountable? I mean, educate your non-EU residing, but wishing she was friend. How does this work? Because I thought she was super unpopular. I was surprised that she got elected in for another term.
So I think it's also really hard because there are the voices that shout loudest, which may not be a representation of the public sentiment. This is a place that it's a bit hard to be able to understand what the people really feel because there's no proper referendum on the issue. But having said that, there is a limited amount of accountability because once she is voted in or anybody is voted in as the EU Commission president, essentially their mandate is established. Now they have the political process of having to gather and convene support. But frankly speaking, even that is somewhat trimmed, if you will, because at the end of the day, as the Commission president, she has a voice of her own and she is able to mandate and dictate almost what it is that she would like to do. Because we know how the legislative process works, we also know that there is weaknesses there, going back to the governance discussion. And an example that you and I have talked about in the past is about how the EU is presenting a very strong front when it comes to the DMA, the AI Act, the GDPR. And at the same time, on the back end of the same conversation, they're calling on consultants to look for weaknesses in it because they know that they may have to capitulate to US demands. And that in itself is a breakdown of the governance and the process.
And the independence, right? How can you really do what's best for the EU citizens when it might not be the best for the EU as a bloc? Which is where I think we're starting to see that difference. Like, and it's the whole short-term versus long-term gain. That is where I think politics in general just gets so messy because people are so focused. Politicians are so focused on maintaining their stance, maintaining their power. It hurts their nations. It hurts their blocs in the long term to be making difficult decisions. So they won't make those difficult decisions to make their nations or their blocs stronger because it'll make them weaker.
In fact, on that, I want to ask you an opinion question. Voters get one chance to vote for their leader in a 4 or 5 year term, typically. And at the same time, lobbyists have the chance to reach that same individual multiple times over the course of those 4 years. Talk to me about your opinion on why that process works or doesn't work.
I think lobbying is one of the dirtiest industries out there. And I know that it probably is the industry that makes DC run. And I appreciate that there's good stuff that can come out of them. And I'm sure all the cigarette companies are up in arms that I'm saying this, as are all the alcohol companies and the vape companies. But like, seriously, I just do not understand why we need lobbying to exist. I'm having so much trouble understanding the benefits it brings. Okay, fine. You know what? Politicians now get fancier meals because the lobbyists will take them out to dinner or they get invited to the Met Gala because they're there on someone else's dime. But in a government that works with an educated people, where you truly care about the outcome of your society, why would you listen to some 25, 28-year-old guy in a suit who wants to take you out to a 3 Michelin star dinner and try to convince you why certain contracts should be given to either his company or, more importantly, why certain laws should or should not be passed in favor of certain industries? A lot of companies, a lot of industries will be like, oh no, it's an education thing. It's not really lobbying. Think of it as education, because a lot of politicians, they don't know how social media works. They don't know the science behind certain drugs. Cool. Educate them. And while you're educating them, why don't you educate the public as well? Why don't you put out actual materials that, you know what, people will have to read? Put out actual materials that everyone can access. Why do we have to have these hush-hush conversations over what is really in a cigarette, how bad nicotine is? Maybe I'm missing the bigger picture, or maybe I'm just bitter that I don't have that Platinum, Amex, MasterCard, whatever, to get those meals, but I just do not understand the logic behind it.
I can somewhat see why lobbying makes sense in the part that corporations contribute a great deal and they should have a voice in policy decisions. Having said that, I also agree that it's such an opaque process. And we know that lobbying is broken and it is purely commercial interests and all of that to say It's also unfortunate because it's the commercial interests that don't have a counterbalance that are the ones that are sort of getting away with massive amounts of fraud and corruption. And we keep hearing about this from Supreme Court judges going away on fancy holidays to a lot of politicians getting caught red handed taking payoffs. These are some of the most basic crimes, and yet it takes years to uncover it, and the damage is already done. What is a good mechanism for companies to establish a communications channel, essentially, to not just the White House or the EU Commission president or any of these speakers, but going much more beyond that? And that mechanism right now, it started with lobbying and it has gotten much dirtier than what it you originally used to be.
Yeah, so why can't we just have a consortium where people talk about things and they get invited as speakers to argue one point, or involve them in the law, not the lobbying process, but in the legislation process. Give them a chance to speak, give them a chance to share their arguments, give them a chance to educate. I'm all for education. I'm not for sending gold encrusted strawberries to your home for Christmas or your child's 16th birthday.
This is exactly the challenge that we're seeing. And the reporting frameworks that we see for politicians to declare the lobbying efforts that they have been subject to are also really poor mechanisms. But let's move a little bit over to the ethical discussion. And I want to go again back to the basics. I want to talk about the purpose of democracy, because the way I looked at it was that the purpose of democracy is, one, to have informed citizens, because I think that's one of the most important factors, who then vote based on whatever values that they may have, based on the different options presented as candidates. I see three different problems. One is we are all misinformed and our feeds are filled with fake news. So the way that we are going to be informed is already broken down. The second thing is values are fractured because we are now moving further and further towards the extremes. And then on the third side, I also see that most elections only have 2 to 3 viable candidates, which is not a good representation of the different options that that a voter would need to have. So how do you see this purpose of democracy having to evolve to 2025?
Oh, I mean, when you lay it down like that, it's what? It's the disinformation, so the lack of information. It's the broken structures, so you only have between two people to vote between at most. And what
And
was
the
the third?
values that
Oh
you
yeah,
may
the
believe
values.
in.
Okay. Well, the first and the last, the values and the misinformation, you can directly attribute to tech. Information wouldn't exist if we didn't have it. Not that tech creates misinformation, but that it heightens it and it propagates it. So that's not fantastic. Because there are people lying all the time, but you just wouldn't find out about it. And there wouldn't be a cat video about it, so you didn't care to forward it along either. And then the second piece, in terms of the extremes, that's, I think, directly attributable to tech. And again, it's because of that targeting. It's again because they know that showing you this content that will result in you having a visceral reaction will force you to stay on the platform longer. Having polar opposite views is something that's very profitable for them. We have this conversation a lot about how people just aren't conversing. There's no sense of discourse. And because of that, we are having opinions that are further and further apart and starting to see each other as aliens if people don't say and espouse the exact same values that we do. So I don't think I've identified a solution to either of those things, but I have identified a root cause. And then in terms of having maybe one or two viable candidates to choose from, that's just the system in general being broken. And I wonder if it's because it costs too much to enter the race, which really shouldn't. If you're a good candidate, you should be able to run. Shout out to Zoran Mamdani in New York City, who is very much doing a grassroots campaign. I'm not from New York, but I can definitely appreciate someone who is starting out from a grassroots campaign and doing their best to get their word out there. So it is possible, but it's just something that we're not seeing very often. I wonder if we could put a cap to how tech can be used by politicians, which, as I'm saying this, I know is impossible because there's third parties, there's foreign interference. I can think of 5 million reasons this isn't going to work. But if there was a way to put a cap on that, and if there was a way to limit disinformation so it didn't speak to political things, then maybe democracy wouldn't be so broken. And I'm laughing because it's impossible.
You know, I was also thinking about what you just mentioned about Mamdani coming in. In fact, Eric Adams, the current mayor of New York, has pulled out of the race. And the thing that baffled me as a non-American and an outsider is the democratic process, in which the commentary was, how do we get those black votes now? Because they're up for grabs. And that, to me, just made me think of this caricature of vultures going after dead carcasses as though they are not living, breathing, voting people. And this is actually the way I think that a lot of politicians are going about things. It's not in service of the population. It is the opposite. It is, I have an agenda. I have interests that are backing me. So how is it that I'm going to lace the different numbers and the different electoral colleges or the different provinces or the different votes in order for me to just get enough majority in order for me to fulfill this mandate that I believe in? And I think that this whole thing has been reversed in such a way that democracy in itself is completely broken. There's another phenomena that we're starting to see. Now, it's of course leading in the United States, in which we're seeing non-politicians enter the political sphere. And this is of course not just from the nomination from Donald Trump, but we're starting to see that personalities, even in Asia, for example, they rule the way democracy runs. So in the Philippines, for example, you always had famous actors and you had famous athletes getting into the political sphere because they had this following. And one of the things that I'm starting to see is that this ambition that politicians have supersedes everything else, not just in the democratic process, but in the interests of serving people. And I'm just wondering, how do you see this reversing itself when more and more people that have a following, they move into the sphere that originally used to be the tech sphere and other industries that used to have all the big dollar figures, but now it's politics that have all the dollar figures. And they just want that because on top of that, they get power.
The power. I was waiting for you to get to that. And it's not just the movie stars and the athletes. In the US, it's the tech bros. I mean, we saw Elon try really hard to get involved in government. I would argue it's because he wanted a taste of that power that he just cannot get being the richest man on earth. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a way to solve it. Ego is one of the 7 deadly sins, I believe. And if not, it definitely should be. But it's what keeps rulers in place far beyond when they should be, really when they should have retired, and really when they should be making space for others. But it's just holding on to something. And maybe it's those people who are truly unhappy deep down with themselves, that they're worried that if they don't have this one way of defining themselves, then they won't have anything else. Not to make this super meta, but maybe that's it.
I think you also made a comment that we should shine a light on, because one of the things that I am very interested in, as we start looking at political sphere, as we start looking at politicians, all I see is a lot of gray. And I'd be really curious to see what is this new tranche of politicians that's coming in that are younger, that are more mobilized, and that are quicker to think on their feet and more values driven, which is something that we see in the youth, in such a way that they can actually gravitate people towards different directions. And one of the things I am also seeing is that many of them are also falling for power structures. And so they are leaning into how is it that they can individually gain as opposed to serve the public sphere.
Reminds me of the conversation I had with Eugenia on Rethinking Tech a few months ago now, and I highly recommend people listen to it if they haven't already, but it's about youth involvement and how to bring them in. And it is alarming that for many countries where the youth are in the majority, but even in the countries where they're not, they do not have a seat at the table. They aren't even allowed to share their concerns or voice their concerns because the average age of entry is 40, 45 plus. And as much as I wish that was still considered a youthful age, it is just not. And so that requires society in general to let go of those power structures that they've had. It requires the people at the top to make room for it. Again, that requires them to put their ego aside and maybe just hang out with their families for a bit. Democracy remains a powerful idea. But in an era of targeted persuasion, algorithmic amplification, and state and corporate leverage over information, we must rebuild its guardrails. If we don't, the form of democracy that we champion, that we talk about, is going to be decided by attention economies and backroom data deals, not by you and I. Thanks for tuning in. New episodes drop every Tuesday. See you then.